China is one of the world's oldest civilizations, and for thousands of years, its contact with the rest of the world was rare. A succession of imperial dynasties, many lasting hundreds of years, created a unique culture influenced by the ideals of Confucius, the great Chinese teacher and philosopher who lived almost 3,000 years ago. Over time, trade would bring the Chinese into contact with other cultures, and exchanges began. The Chinese adopted Buddhism as a religion, and Western civilizations, beginning with the Romans, were fascinated by unique Chinese goods and inventions. The Silk Road trade brought silk, tea, and porcelain to the world, and Chinese inventions such as gunpowder as well. For centuries, the Chinese protected the unique production methods behind these special sought-after products and showed little interest in what the outside world could offer them. The Chinese believed their culture more advanced and outsiders to be barbarians. With European exploration of the so-called New World, the dynamic began to change. The Chinese consumed most of the silver produced by the Spanish from their American colonies. And when the frustrated British dumped opium in Chinese markets, sparking the Opium Wars, which China lost, it kicked off what became known as the Century of Humiliation. It was only at this time that large-scale migration from China would take place, and sizable Chinese settlements would be established in the outside world. For hundreds of years, the Qing had prevented many educated Chinese from leaving the country, even under threat of execution.
You're not supposed to leave China, or the members of the literati, because you are basically the treasurers of the Confucian teaching, and also you are the pillars of society. But for ordinary people, really, you can smuggle yourself quite easily out of China.
When the Russo-Japanese War was won by the Japanese, Japan became a great model for China because it had defeated a Western power. So Chinese intellectuals who wanted to advance themselves as possible advisors to Chinese governments went west and east to Japan for their education.
The first regions populated by the Chinese diaspora were in Asia. In cities such as Penang in Malaysia, the early Chinese immigrants who found success built elaborate so-called clan houses, which would celebrate their culture and be welcoming halfway houses for newly arrived immigrants looking to find their feet.
What we have at the 19th century is a global dispersal of the Chinese around the world, really, with enormous impact on every one of the countries that they went to. So we have in Southeast Asia, they go there really for through the existing trade links that they are developing themselves, and have a huge impact on really developing industry and trade across Southeast Asia, to the extent that they become extremely successful, and in many cases, are leaders within the industry in those countries.
But not all Chinese immigrants were well off or even free settlers. Singapore imported tens of thousands of so-called Chinese coolies as cheap labour. Now, not only was the Chinese elite leaving the country to seek work abroad, but soon Chinese workers would become a source of cheap labour in America, the British Empire, and beyond, following the abolition of the slave trade.
Black Africans are certainly politically incorrect, but Asians are fine. So you sign up for 8 years of your life as an Indian or a Chinese. then you'll be sent to those plantations to replace the black laborers or slaves. So that's the beginning of the overseas Chinese diasporas.
Between 1821 and 1945, about 3 million contract labourers were shipped out of China. The evolution of slavery caused a shortage of labour, and the coolie trade was introduced. Unlike the Chinese, who emigrated voluntarily, these coolies were press-ganged into ships. The increase in gambir and pepper plantations brought many Chinese cultivators, traders, and labourers to Singapore. Most of them had to borrow money for their passage over and had to work for years to pay off their debts.
Chinatown is actually a shade and shelter for the early immigrants. They came here facing a lot of hardship. So the conditions which they found themselves, they had to get used to it. For example, in the coolie houses, it was very congested. Sometimes many of these coolie houses were run along the basis of a few hundred people living in a small cubicle. It's not just a few people living in a room.
Indentured Chinese labour spread across the world in the 19th century, reaching Latin America and cities such as Peru's capital, Lima. Following the example of planters in the West Indies, Mauritius and Cuba, Peruvians turned to the importation of Chinese coolies for their guano and sugar enterprises. Dr. Chang explains the fate of these Chinese settlers in Peru.
The coolies in China were contracted to work in Peru, and they were given the illusion that after the 8 years they were going to work in Peru, they would have enough money to live far better than in China, and they came with contracts to work for about equivalent to $8 a month, of which 4 were subtracted to pay for the sea fare. The labor conditions of the coolies in Peru were appalling, and when they infringed any of the arbitrary rules, they were punished severely. And when they escaped, they were captured, they were branded and put in chains. Nevertheless, they remained and finished their contracts and obtained their liberty and stay in the country as businessmen. After 1874, there were other waves of Chinese that came as free agents. Some of them were friends or relatives of the coolies. Others had heard of Peru and the land of opportunity. Today, the population is about 10 to 15% of the total population of the country.
There were disproportionately young male, and there were disproportionately the eldest son in the family. And they were sent out to make a little fortune for the rest of the family. Yeah, so in that regard, this is really a family business. Yeah? You know, if you go to West Indies, if you go to California, if you go to Melbourne, if you go to New Zealand, you may actually get rich. Although very few actually did. Indentured laborer really is very attractive. It's a big sum of money. Only at the end of the term you will get full pay, and that's really it's a saving scheme, right? And this is really the demand side, and you have a huge market, especially in America. And the supply side is you have enough Chinese being able to leave their family farms, yeah, and then and go for it, yeah. Of course, there's a percentage of Chinese never return home. They get married, they settled, or some of them just died.
Not all Chinese labour was indentured, and with the California gold rush in 1848, Chinese fortune seekers joined those from around the world in the gold fields. Chinese labourers were also invited into the United States to help construct the transcontinental railway, which linked America's east and west coasts. The labourers were deployed on the most difficult and dangerous jobs, constructing tunnels like this one in California, known as the Chinese Wall.
It's really one of the great engineering achievements in America in the 19th century because this is what's called a dry-laid wall. There is no mortar. These are locked like a jigsaw puzzle, and that's why it's so stable. There was an acute labor shortage of white males in California. A lot of California men had gone to Nevada to search for silver. So they needed labor, and in the city of Auburn, there was a Chinese population. They reluctantly hired them, and they thought, they really can't do anything. They're smaller than us, they're weaker than us, they don't speak our language, they don't know what they're doing, but they were there. And it turned out that the Chinese were such good workers, such fabulous workers, that the railroad began to search all over the western states for Chinese. They even sent contractors to Guangzhou province and brought back shiploads of Chinese.
The labourers were used to blast passages through the mountains, so-called Chinese powder monkeys.
1,654 feet on 4 faces, nearly 2 years. Winter and summer, working essentially 24 hours a day.
About the same time, gold was discovered in far-off Australia, and the Chinese were to be found among the prospectors there. News of the discovery of gold spread. The 1850s saw the arrival of people from all over the world, including many thousands of Chinese. But they didn't have it easy and experienced racism from the colonists.
The Victorian government, they did everything in their power to try and stop the Chinese from coming into Victoria. They didn't like them because they worked hard and they ate different food, spoke a different language, and what they did, they put a £10 head tax on them to stop the Chinese coming into the Melbourne port. And what they did, they travelled to South Australia, to Robe, and they had to walk from Robe to Bendigo. The ones that got to the goldfields were only allowed to mine the soil that the Europeans mined and considered useless. And then they put on a £4 residence tax. There was no immigration for Chinese women, and they never lifted those restrictions until 1978.
But despite being ostracised, the Chinese brought change to Australia, including the introduction of market gardening.
And they grew those vegetables. Now, if it hadn't been for the pioneer of the market gardening, a lot of those early miners would have died. They wouldn't have had any fresh veggies.
As Chinese populations grew in the US and elsewhere in the second half of the 19th century, they suffered widespread discrimination, which culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act.
As well as the significance of the Chinese themselves and the kind of input they put into helping develop these nations, we have a huge backlash against them. For example, in 1882, following the economic slump of the 1870s, there is the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US. In Australia, in 1901, there's brought in the White Australia policy. And even though it's White Australia and aims at a whole range of minorities, it specifically targets the Chinese. We also have in 1904 the Chinese Exclusion Act in South Africa. And in Britain, there is no specific Exclusion Act, but there are kind of a range of smaller pieces of legislation that are brought in that discourage Chinese migration, such as language tests that disadvantage them. So during that period, there's this huge peak, I would say, in xenophobia. And this is, as I've just said, state legitimized by the state. And that, in turn, in terms of what happens on the ground, is that you see a huge surge in anti-Chinese racial violence, where workers and dockers become attacked by local, whether South Africans, Americans, Australians, and British. We have the construction of particular ideas around Chineseness. So in the 19th century, you have this hugely significant tag called the Yellow Peril. And it's this fear of the Chinese through their migrations, going around the world and essentially taking over the world. So they become a threat to the general populations in terms of their employment. But another major factor is the impact and fear around their attraction to the local white women in those countries. So there is this continual fear about losing our jobs and our women to these Chinese people. But there's also, in addition to that, I think there's a kind of a threat to ideas around civilization. You know, if they come with their different ways and take over our culture, it's going to obliterate somehow our culture as we know it.
The Chinese continued to suffer a myriad of deprivations into the 20th century. They were prevented from owning property.
I tried to buy a piece of land, they wouldn't sell to me because I'm Chinese. I told them I'm born here, I'm an American citizen, I'm entitled to it. But they said no. Then I saw a little farm, 5-acre farm that I want to buy, and my husband and I thought for sure that we won't be living next to the white people, we can get the little ranch. And then I talked to the man that owned it, and he said, I'm sorry, Mrs. King, I can't sell it to you because you're Chinese. And that got me a little upset, see? So I've been fighting for my land ever since. 2004, December 11, 2004, I finally got the land that I wanted all this year. I waited for 55 years. I was so worried that I might die before I get the land, but anyway, I got the land before I die anyway.
In an effort to clamp down on immigration and the growth of the Chinese population, wives were prevented from travelling to the United States with their husbands. Li King-Wong's story is both shocking and deeply moving.
My father was not allowed to bring my mother over as his wife. We were taken to Angel Island right away, and Mama and my two sisters and I were taken to the women's barrack, and they locked the barrack door. It was kind of gloomy. It was not a cheerful place. Mama looked at us. She said, don't forget, call me Auntie. Call me Yi. We waited around to be interrogated, and they told us that we have to tell the truth, answer the questions, and please do not lie. And of course, they asked questions about Mama. They said, that lady over there, is she your mother or is she your aunt? And I said, she is our aunt. And then the interpreter smiled, and he said, little girl, I am going to ask you, what is your name? And my little sister was so happy, and she said, huh, you don't tell me your name, why should I tell you my name? And the interpreter started to laugh, and the chief inspector said, all right, I believe you. And so he got a stamp, he stamped the papers and said, we're gonna tell your papa that, you know, you are fine, and he's gonna be waiting for you in San Francisco. For 40 years, we still pretended that Mama was our aunt. And it was not until 1972, Mama and I went to the attorney. She confessed. And we were kind of worried. And the attorney was so nice. Oh, don't worry. Oh, we know the story. It's fine. You just go home. So Mama was very happy. She became Mrs. G in 1972.
In today's San Francisco, it's a very different place. The Chinatown here is one of the largest in the world. Across the Atlantic, Chinese migrants also found their way to Europe, to cities such as London.
My name is Mun Wei Tu. My family came in the 50s over from Hong Kong, and in 1967 they established this bakery here in what's now London Chinatown. Gay Mi Bao, a coconut custard bread. Oh, it's sensational. So it was actually my grandfather who came over initially first in 55, and through working himself in different jobs, he was able to build himself up to be able to make a start of this business. So later on, my grandmother came over, and now she's the she's in charge here, and she's 80 now, and she's amazing. That's great. When they established it, they were able to bring over some relations and relatives from the village to come and work who were skilled in baking. And it was great because 90% of the customers were Chinese, and actually are still today.
As the most populous country in the world, it is of little surprise that China has one of the largest diasporas on the planet. It is estimated that there are 50 million Chinese people living overseas, with 100 million of Chinese descent. The countries with the highest Chinese populations are Thailand, 10.3 million, Malaysia, 6.6 million, the United States of America, 5 million, Indonesia, 2.8 million, Singapore, 2.6 million, Canada, 1.8 million, South Korea, 1.6 million, Myanmar, 1.6 million, the Philippines, 1.3 million, and Australia, 1.2 million. Today, Chinese communities outside of China remain tight-knit, symbolized by the many Chinatowns established across the world, in cities such as New York, San Francisco, Mexico City, London, and Lima in Peru. As with many diasporas, there has been a remarkable assimilation of emigrants into their new homes. Here in San Francisco, contestants compete for the title of Miss Chinatown USA.
What's great about Miss Chinatown USA, it's not just a Chinese community event or an American community event, but it's something about being Chinese American, and it really just fuses in the best of both worlds, the best of both cultures together.
While in New York, home to 500,000 people of Chinese descent, Chinese American veterans and their descendants take part in a parade honoring their participation in World War II. The Chinese diaspora is one of the most visible in the world. Despite the lengthy and brutal mistreatment endured by Chinese immigrants, the cultural impact they have left is hugely significant. Even now, in the 21st century, a re-emergent and energized Chinese homeland has transformed the way the outside world views China and the Chinese.
Just the word Far East, is very indicative. It's remote, it's kind of mysterious. It's either been, romanticized. You think of chinoiserie, in the time of George III and George IV in Britain and in France and Europe. Kind of idea of China being a place of high culture. And on the other hand, you've got this demonization, what some people have called, the story of Fu Manchu, this character dreamt up by a British-Irish writer in the early 20th century who'd never set foot, in China, and yet imagined, this kind of sinister figure, Dr. Fu Manchu, who then, of course, was played in films rather hilariously by Christopher Lee, who, as far as I could see, had not a trace of Chinese blood in him. So, this has been there a long time. And I guess in the 21st century, it's complemented by the fact that China's politically quite alien. It's the perfect storm, really, this place which has a long history of being othered, and then it's politically, kind of very different too. And I think, these are not going to be easy things to dispel. And all of it's compounded, I suppose, by the fact that really there's not a great tradition of people in Europe in particular, and America and Australia, being willing to be very well informed about Asian languages and cultures, but in particular Chinese language and culture. So it's easy to see how this sort of complex is built up and how hard it's going to be to unpick that.
Chinese culture, particularly cuisine and its many variations, has made a distinct impact on diets around the world. Chinese New Year offers the opportunity for the Chinese everywhere to celebrate their history, culture, and traditions. While the Chinese diaspora is one of the world's biggest, it's a tiny number compared to China's population of 1.5 billion.
So currently we have 30 million Chinese diaspora population outside China. It's not a big number, right? Considering China has a population of 1.4 billion. There's a really tiny, percentage of Chinese.
The fact is, very few Chinese actually choose to live outside mainland China. The impact of those who do is a remarkable reflection of the influence of one of the world's oldest civilizations.